I watched political developments after the Austrian Anschluss from a point far from the centre of military affairs. At the beginning of February 1938, after I had risen to the second most senior post on the German army staff, that of Oberquartiermeister, the deputy to the Chief of Staff, my career as a General Staff Officer had abruptly ended. When Colonel General Baron versus Fritsch was eliminated as Commander-in-Chief of the Army through a diabolical party intrigue, a number of his closest collaborators, myself included, had been removed from the Army High Command, OKH, along with him. Since then, as Commander of 18 Division, I had naturally ceased to be informed of matters falling within the High Command's jurisdiction. Indeed, since the beginning of April 1938, I had been able to devote myself entirely to my job as a divisional commander. It was a particularly satisfying task, even more satisfying in those years than at any other time, but it also called for every ounce of one's energy, since the expansion of the army was still far from complete. The continual formation of new units entailed a constant reorganization of those already in existence, while the speed of rearmament, and especially the attendant growth of both the officer and non-commissioned officer corps, meant that the most exacting demands were made on commanders at all levels if we were to fulfill our aim of creating intrinsically stable and highly trained troops who would guarantee the security of the Reich. To succeed in this work was more gratifying still, especially in my own case, now that, after several years in Berlin, I once again had the pleasure of being in direct touch with combat units. It is with immense gratitude, therefore, that I remember that last year and a half of peace, and, in particular, the Silesians of whom 18 Division was largely composed. Silesia had produced good soldiers from time immemorial, so the military education and training of the new units was a rewarding task. It is true that the brief interlude of the Floral War, the occupation of the Sudetenland, had found me in the post of Chief of Staff of the Army commanded by Colonel General Ritter versus Lieb. As such, I had learned of the conflict that had broken out between the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Beck, and Hitler over the Czech question, and which, to my intense regret, had ended with the resignation of the Chief of Staff I so revered. This resignation, however, snapped the thread which had kept me in touch with OKH, and so it was not until summer 1939 that I learned of Operation Order White, the first offensive deployment against Poland to be prepared on Hitler's orders. No such thing had existed before the spring of 1939. On the contrary, all military preparations on our eastern frontier had been based on defence. In the above Operation Order, I was earmarked as Chief of Staff of Southern Army Group, the Commander-in-Chief of which was to be Colonel General Verser Rundstedt, then already living in retirement. It was planned that this army group should deploy in Silesia, Eastern Moravia, and partly in Slovakia, in accordance with the detailed arrangements which we were now to work out. As the Army Group headquarters did not exist in peacetime and would be set up only in the event of general mobilization, a small working party was formed to deal with the new operation order. It assembled on 12th of August 1939 in the Silesian training area of Neuhammer. It was to work under the direction of Colonel Blumentritt, a General Staff Officer who was destined to become the Army Group's Chief of Operations, IA, on mobilization. This was an unusual stroke of luck as far as I was concerned, for my relationship with that exceptionally able man was one of the closest confidence. The bond had been forged while we were both serving at the headquarters of V. Lieb's army during the Sudeten crisis, and I considered it extremely valuable to have a colleague on whom I could rely in times like these. As often as not, the things that attract us to another person are quite trivial, and what always delighted me about Blumentritt was his fanatical attachment to the telephone. The speed at which he worked was in any case incredibly high, but whenever he had a receiver in his hand, he could deal with whole avalanches of queries, always with the same imperturbable good humour. In mid-August, the future commander of Southern Army Group, Colonel General Verser Rundstedt, arrived at Neuhammer. Everyone among us knew him. As an exponent of grand tactics, he was brilliant, a talented soldier who grasped the essentials of any problem in an instant. Indeed, He would concern himself with nothing else, being supremely indifferent to minor detail. He was a gentleman of the old school, a type, I fear, which is now dying out, but which once added a delightful variant to life. The general had a charm about him to which even Hitler succumbed. The latter seemed to have taken a genuine liking to him, and, surprisingly enough, there was even a glimmer of this left after he had twice dismissed him. What probably attracted Hitler was the indefinable impression the general gave of a man from a past which he did not understand, and to the atmosphere of which he never had access. As a matter of interest, when our working party assembled at Neuhammer, my own 18 Division was also in the training area for the annual regimental and divisional exercises. That everyone among us, disquieted by the number of emergencies through which the fatherland had passed since 1933, wondered where all this would lead, I need hardly say. Our thoughts and private conversations at this time were centred on the signs of the gathering storm on the horizon around us. We realised that Hitler was fanatically resolved to dispose of the very last of the territorial problems Germany had inherited through the Treaty of Versailles. We knew that he had begun negotiations with Poland as far back as autumn 1938 to clear up the whole Polish-German frontier question, though what progress, if any, these negotiations had made we were not told. At the same time, we were aware of the British guarantee to Poland, and I can safely say that not one of us in the army was so arrogant, thoughtless, or short-sighted as not to recognise the deadly seriousness of the warning that guarantee implied. This factor alone, though it was not the only one, convinced our party in Neuhammer that there would in the end be no war. Even if the deployment plan on which we were now engaged went into operation, that still need not, in our opinion, mean war. We had watched Germany's precarious course along the razor's edge to date with close attention, and were increasingly amazed at Hitler's incredible luck in attaining, hitherto without recourse to arms, all his overt and covert political aims. The man seemed to have an almost infallible instinct. Success had followed success in a never-ending progression, if one may initially refer to the glittering train of events that ultimately led to our downfall as successes. All those things had been achieved without war. Why, we asked ourselves, should it be different this time? Look at Czechoslovakia. Though Hitler had drawn up a menacing array of troops against her in 1938, there had still been no war. Yet the old adage about taking the pitcher to the well once too often still echoed in our ears, for the position was now a much trickier one, and the game Hitler seemed intent on playing had a more dangerous look about it. There was the British guarantee to contend with this time. But then we recalled Hitler's assertion that he would never be so mad as to unleash a war on two fronts, as the German leaders of 1914 had done. That at least implied that he was a man of reason, even if he had no human feelings left. Raising that coarse voice of his, he had explicitly assured his military advisers that he was not idiot enough to bungle his way into a world war for the sake of Danzig or the Polish corridor. Poland was bound to be a source of great bitterness to us after she had used the dictated Peace of Versailles to annex German territories, to which neither historical justice nor the right of self-determination gave her any claim. For us soldiers, she had been a constant cause of distress in the years of Germany's weakness. Every time we looked at the map, we were reminded of our precarious situation, that irrational demarcation of the frontier, that mutilation of our fatherland, that corridor whose severance of East Prussia from the Reich gave us every reason to fear for that lovely province. For all that, however, the army had never dreamt of fighting an aggressive war against Poland to end this state of affairs by force. Apart from anything else, such forbearance had a perfectly simple military reason. Any attack on Poland would have plunged the Reich into a war on two or more fronts, and with this it could never have coped. In the period of weakness imposed on us at Versailles, we had always had the cauchemar de coalition, a nightmare that disturbed us all the more whenever we thought of the aspirations for German territory still harboured with such ill-concealed longing by wide circles of the Polish people. Yet although we had no wish to fight an aggressive war, we could hardly hope, even taking the most unprejudiced view of the Polish mentality, to sit down peacefully at the same table as the Poles to revise those senseless frontiers. Neither did it seem beyond the bounds of possibility that Poland might herself take the initiative one day and set out to solve the frontier question by force. We had gained some experience in this respect since 1918, and in Germany's years of weakness it had been just as well to be prepared for such a thing. Once Marshal Pilsudski's voice was silent, and certain nationalist circles had gained a decisive influence in Poland, an incursion into East Prussia or Upper Silesia was just as feasible as the Polish raid on Vilna before it. For that contingency, though, our military deliberations had found a political answer. If Poland were proved to be the aggressor and we succeeded in warding off the attack, the Reich might well have an opportunity to get the unhappy frontier question revised on the political rebound. At all events, there was no exaggerated wishful thinking on the subject on the part of any army leaders. Although General Wrz-Rabenau, in the book Siegt aus meinem Leben, quotes the Colonel General as saying that Poland's existence is intolerable and incompatible with Germany's essential needs, she must disappear through her own internal weakness and through Russia. With help from ourselves, this was in fact an attitude already overtaken by developments in the political and military fields. We had a pretty fair idea of the growing military power of the Soviet Union, and France, the land under whose spell one so easily fell, still faced us with the same hostility as ever. She would always seek allies in Germany's rear. But if the Polish state were to disappear, the mighty Soviet Union could become a far more dangerous ally of France than a buffer state like Poland was at present. Any elimination of the buffer formed by Poland and Lithuania between Germany and the Soviet Union could lead only too easily to differences between the two big powers. While it might be a matter of mutual interest to carry out frontier revisions vis-à-vis Poland, the complete removal of that state would hardly be to Germany's advantage in view of the entirely changed situation that now prevailed. So whether we liked her or not, it was preferable to keep Poland between us and the Soviet Union. Aggrieved though we were as soldiers by the senseless and explosive frontier demarcation in the east, Poland was still less dangerous as a neighbour than the Soviet Union. Like all other Germans, of course, we hoped a revision of the frontier would come about sometime and return the predominantly German-populated areas to the Reich in accordance with the natural right of their inhabitants. At the same time, it was most undesirable from the military point of view that the size of our Polish population should increase. As for the German demand for a union of East Prussia with the Reich, it could well have been harmonized with Poland's desire for a seaport of her own. This, and none other, was the trend of thought on the Polish problem favoured by the majority of German soldiers in the days of the Reichswehr. Let us say from the end of the 1920s onwards, whenever the question of armed conflict cropped up. Then the wheel of fate turned once again. Adolf Hitler appeared on the stage. Everything changed, including the basis of our relationship with Poland. The Reich concluded a non-aggression pact and treaty of friendship with our eastern neighbour. We were freed from the nightmare of a possible Polish attack. At the same time, relations between Germany and the Soviet Union cooled off, our new ruler having only too clearly voiced his hatred of the Bolshevik system in public speeches. Poland was bound to feel less constrained politically in consequence of this new situation, but that was no longer a danger as far as we were concerned. German rearmament and Hitler's series of successes in the field of foreign policy made it improbable that she would use her new freedom of action against the Reich, and when she proved only too ready to take a hand in the partitioning of Czechoslovakia, it seemed not unlikely that we could talk business about the frontier question. Until spring 1939 then, the High Command of the German Army never had any plan for offensive deployment against Poland on its files. Before that, all our military measures in the East had been purely defensive in character. Was it to be the real thing this time, in autumn 1939? Did Hitler really want war, or would he, as with Czechoslovakia in 1938, bring the very limit of pressure to bear, militarily and otherwise, to settle the Danzig and corridor questions: war or bluff? That was the question exercising the mind of everyone without any real insight into political developments, primarily into Hitler's own intentions. And who, for that matter, was vouchsafed any insight whatever into those intentions? At all events, it was entirely conceivable that the military measures taken in August 1939, despite Operation Order White, were directed towards increasing political pressure on Poland. Since the summer, on orders from Hitler, work had been proceeding at feverish speed on an Ostwall, an eastern equivalent of the Siegfried Line. Whole divisions, the 18th among them, were moved to the Polish frontier in constant rotation to work on this fortification for several weeks at a stretch. What was the point of all this effort if Hitler were going to attack Poland? Even if, contrary to all his assurances, he were contemplating a war on two fronts, the Ostwall would still have been quite out of place, since the only proper action for Germany in such circumstances would be to attack and overwhelm Poland first while remaining on the defensive in the west. The reverse solution, offensive action in the west and defensive measures in the east, was quite out of the question with the present ratio of forces, especially as neither plans nor preparations for an offensive in the west had been made. So if the construction of an Ostwall were to have any rhyme or reason in the present situation, it could surely only be to exert pressure on Poland by placing large troop concentrations on her frontier. Even the deployment of infantry divisions on the east bank of the Oder in the last 10 days of August, and the movement of the armoured and motorised divisions into assembly areas initially west of the river, need not really have been preparations for an attack. They could just as well have been a form of political pressure. Be that as it may, the peacetime training programme went on just as usual for the time being. On 13th and 14th August, I had my last divisional exercise at Neuhammer, winding up with a march past at which Colonel General versus Rundstedt took the salute. On 15th of August, there was a big artillery shoot in cooperation with the Luftwaffe. It was marked by a tragic accident. An entire dive bomber squadron, obviously wrongly informed about cloud altitude, failed to pull out of a dive in time and tore straight into a wood. There was one more regimental scheme the next day, and then the divisional units went back to their normal garrisons, though they were to leave for the Silesian frontier again only a few days later. On 19th August, versus Rundstedt and I received instructions to attend a conference at the Obersalzberg on the 21st. On 10th August, we drove from Liegnitz to my brother-in-law's estate near Linz and spent the night there, reaching Berchtesgaden the following morning. All the army group and army commanders and their chiefs of staff were reporting to Hitler, as well as the appropriate Navy and Luftwaffe leaders. The conference, or rather Hitler's address, as he was not going to let the occasion turn into an open discussion after his experience at a conference with the chiefs of staff the previous year, before the Czech crisis, took place in the big reception chamber of the Berghof that looked out towards Salzburg. Shortly before Hitler appeared, Göring came in. He was an extraordinary sight. Up till now, I had assumed that we were here for a serious purpose, but Göring appeared to have taken it for a masked ball. He was dressed in a soft-collared white shirt, worn under a green jerkin adorned with big buttons of yellow leather. In addition, he wore grey shorts and long grey silk stockings that displayed his impressive calves to considerable effect. This dainty hosiery was offset by a pair of massive laced boots. To cap it all, his paunch was girded by a sword belt of red leather richly inlaid with gold, at which dangled an ornamental dagger in an ample sheath of the same material. I could not resist whispering to my neighbour, General Vers Salmuth, "I suppose the fat boy's here as a strong-arm man?" Hitler's speech on this occasion was the subject of various prosecution documents at the Nuremberg trial. One of these asserted that he had indulged in the vilest of language, and that Göring, delighted at the prospect of war, had jumped on the table and yelled, "Sieg Heil!" All this is quite untrue. It is equally untrue that Hitler said anything about his only fear being a last-minute offer of mediation from some pig-dog or other. While the tone of his speech was certainly that of a man whose mind was firmly made up, he was far too good a psychologist to think he could impress a gathering of this kind with tirades or bad language. The substance of the speech has been correctly reported in Greiner's book Die Oberste Wehrmachtführung, 1939-43. This report is based on a verbal summary given to the author by Colonel Warlimont for inclusion in his war diary and on shorthand notes taken by Admiral Canaris. A certain amount of information on the speech may also be gathered from Colonel General Hyder's diary, although here too, as in the case of the statements made by Warlimont and Canaris, I feel a number of things may have been included which were actually heard from Hitler on other occasions. The impression left on those of us generals who did not belong to the top circle of military leaders was approximately this. Hitler was absolutely determined to bring the German-Polish question to a head this time, even at the price of war. If, however, the Poles were to give in to German pressure, now approaching its climax in the deployment, albeit still camouflaged, of the German armies, a peaceful solution still did not seem excluded, and Hitler was convinced that when it came to the point the Western powers would once again not resort to arms. He was at special pains to develop the latter thesis, his main arguments being the backwardness of British and French armaments, particularly with regard to air strength and anti-aircraft defence, the virtual inability of the Western powers to render Poland any effective help except by an assault on the Siegfried Line, a step which neither power was likely to risk in view of the great sacrifice of blood it would entail, the international situation, particularly the tension in the Mediterranean, which considerably reduced Britain's freedom of movement, the internal situation in France, and last but not least the personalities of the responsible statesmen. Neither Chamberlain nor Daladier, Hitler contended, would take upon themselves the decision to go to war. Logical and conclusive, though his appreciation of the Western powers' position appeared to be in many respects, I still do not think Hitler's audience was entirely convinced by his exposition. The British guarantee was certainly the only real obstacle to his designs, but it was nevertheless a pretty weighty one. What Hitler had to say about an eventual war with Poland could not, in my opinion, be interpreted as a policy of annihilation, which was the sense given to it by the Nuremberg prosecution. When Hitler called for the swift and ruthless destruction of the Polish army, this was, in military parlance, merely the aim that must be the basis of any big offensive operation. At all events, nothing he had said could give us any hint of how he was to treat the Poles later on. The biggest surprise, and also the deepest impression, was caused, quite naturally, by the announcement of the impending pact with the Soviet Union. On our way to Berchtesgaden, we had already read newspaper reports of the conclusion of an economic agreement, and that in itself was quite a sensation. Now we were told that Foreign Minister Verser-Ribbentrop, who was present at the conference and took leave of Hitler in our presence, was flying to Moscow to sign a non-aggression pact with Stalin. By this move, Hitler declared, he was depriving the Western powers of their trump card, for even a blockade of Germany would be ineffectual from now on. Hitler hinted that in order to facilitate the pact he had already made considerable concessions to the Soviet Union in the Baltic and in respect of Poland's eastern frontiers, but his remarks gave no reason for inferring that there would be a complete partition of Poland. Indeed, he is now known to have still been considering leaving a Polish rump state in existence even after the campaign had started. As a result of Hitler's address, neither Weser Rundstedt nor I, and presumably none of the other generals either, concluded that war was now inevitable. Two factors in particular persuaded us that, as at Munich, there would be an 11th-hour settlement. The first was that the pact with the Soviet Union now rendered Poland's position hopeless from the start. If Britain, virtually deprived of the weapon of blockade, were compelled to take the bloody course of attacking in the West in order to aid Poland, it seemed likely enough that, under pressure from the French, she would advise Warsaw to give in. Similarly, it must henceforth be clear to Poland that the British guarantee was now practically inoperative. If it came to a war with Germany, moreover, she must expect the Russians to take action in her rear with a view to accomplishing their old demands on her eastern territory. What else could Warsaw do in this situation but give way? A further consideration was the conference we had just attended. What was its purpose? Hitherto, on the military side, the intention to attack Poland had been camouflaged in every possible way. The presence of divisions in the eastern areas had been explained by the construction of an eastern rampart, and to conceal the purpose of the troop movements to East Prussia, an enormous Tannenberg celebration had been arranged. Preparations for big motorized troop maneuvers had been going on until the very last moment. There had been no official mobilization. Though these measures could not possibly escape the notice of the Poles and were obviously intended as political pressure, they had still been enveloped in the greatest secrecy and accompanied by every form of deception. Yet now, at the very height of the crisis, Hitler had summoned every one of his senior commanders to the Obersalzberg, an action that could not possibly be concealed. To us, this seemed to be the climax of a policy of deliberate bluff. In other words, was Hitler not after all working for a settlement, despite his bellicose utterances? Was not this very conference meant to apply the final squeeze? Such were the thoughts of Colonel General Verser Rundstedt and myself as we left Berchtesgaden. While he travelled on ahead to our Nice headquarters, I stopped on in Liegnitz for a further day with my family. This alone was a measure of my inner disbelief in the likelihood of an imminent outbreak of war. At noon on 24th August, Colonel General Verser Rundstedt assumed command of the army group. On 25th August, at 3:25 in the afternoon, we received the following cipher message from the High Command of the Army. Operation Plan White, D-Day, Font 26:8, H-Hour, Franchouer 04:30. So the decision to go to war, the decision we had not wanted to believe possible, had apparently been taken. I was at dinner with Colonel General Verser Rundstedt in our quarters at the Monastery of the Holy Cross in Nice, when the following order from the High Command came through by telephone. Do not, repeat, not, commence hostilities. Halt all troop movements. Mobilization to continue. Deployment for plans. White and West to proceed as scheduled. Every soldier can judge what an 11th-hour counter-order of this kind implied. Within the space of a few hours, 3 armies moving straight for the frontier across a zone extending from Lower Silesia to the eastern part of Slovakia had to be brought to a halt, not forgetting that all headquarters staffs up to at least divisional level were also on the march, and that there was still a security ban on wireless traffic. Despite all the difficulties, we managed to notify everybody in good time, a first-rate piece of work by the operations and signals staffs. Nevertheless, one motorized regiment in eastern Slovakia could only be stopped after an officer in a Fiesler Storch aircraft had landed at the head of the column in the darkness. We were not told Hitler's reasons for what seemed to be an 11th-hour reversal of his decision to fight. All we heard was that the negotiations were continuing. It will be appreciated that we as soldiers were considerably shaken by leadership of this kind. The decision to go to war is, after all, the gravest that a head of state ever has to take. How could any man reach such a decision and then cancel it again in the space of a few hours? Least of all when that cancellation placed him, in the military sense, at a severe disadvantage. As I pointed out above when describing the Obersalzberg conference, everything in the military sphere was aimed at taking the enemy by surprise. There was no public announcement of the mobilization, the first call-up being scheduled for 26th August, the day of the invasion that had this very moment been stopped. This meant that we were to march into Poland with nothing more than our sum total of armoured and motorised formations, plus a limited number of infantry divisions that were already in the frontier areas or in the process of being made immediately operational. There could be no question now of catching the enemy unawares, for even though the movement of troops into their final concentration areas behind the frontier was being carried out by night, it could certainly not elude the enemy's attention, particularly as the motorized units in assembly areas west of the Oder had to form up in daylight in order to cross the river. Consequently, if there really were to be war, the other alternative must now come into effect. invasion with all our mobilized forces. The element of surprise was lost in any case. As the original decision to start hostilities could not be regarded as an act of ill-considered frivolity on Hitler's part, we could only deduce that the whole thing was simply a continuation of diplomatic tactics to bring ever-increasing pressure to bear on the Poles. So when, at 1700 hours on 31st August, we received a fresh order, D. Severav 1.9, H. 0445, Colonel General Vers Rundstedt and I were sceptical, particularly as no mention was made of the negotiations having failed. Within our own army group, at any rate, we were all set this time, in view of what had occurred on 25th August, to cope with another last-minute stoppage of the operation. The General and I stayed up till midnight in anticipation of the countermand we thought might still come through. Only when midnight had passed and the last possibility of halting the operation had gone could there be no further doubt left. From now on, the weapons would speak. The following factors were decisive in determining the strategic position in the Polish campaign. First, the superiority of the German forces, provided that the German leadership were prepared to accept a considerable risk in the west in order to commit the bulk of its strength against Poland. Secondly, the geographical situation, which enabled the Germans to take the Polish army in a pincer movement from East Prussia on one flank and Silesia and Slovakia on the other. Thirdly, the latent threat present in Poland's rear from the outset in the form of the Soviet Union. The German planners accepted the above-mentioned risk in the west to the full. OKH launched its attack against Poland with 42 divisions of regular troops, including one newly formed armoured division, 10 Panzer, and one new infantry division formed from fortress troops in the Oder water basin, the 50th. They consisted of 24 infantry divisions, 3 mountain divisions, 6 armoured divisions, 4 light divisions, 4 motorised infantry divisions, and 1 cavalry brigade. Then came 16 new divisions not formed until after the general mobilisation and destined for use between the second and fourth waves. These could not initially be regarded as first-rate troops. Also assigned for the Polish campaign were the SS division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and 1 or 2 reinforced SS regiments. For the West, this left only 11 regular divisions, some fortress troops amounting to about a division in strength, later to be formed into 72 infantry division, and 35 newly constituted divisions of second to fourth line troops. No armoured or motorised troops were available. There was thus a total of 46 divisions, of which only 3/4 were conditionally fit to go into action. 22 Infantry Division, which had been trained and equipped as an airborne division, was retained at the disposal of OKH in the interior of the Reich. The bulk of our air forces were likewise committed against Poland in the form of 2 air fleets, a third, weaker one being kept in the west. The risks which the German leadership ran by distributing its forces in this way were undoubtedly very great indeed. Because of the unexpected brevity of the Polish campaign, a development due in part to the loser's own mistakes, and above all as a result of the complete inaction of Poland's Western allies at the time of her defeat, these risks have hardly ever been properly appreciated. It should be realized that at that particular juncture the German command had to reckon with a French army some 90 divisions strong. In autumn 1939, according to Vesey Tippelskirch, France actually raised 108 divisions in the space of 3 weeks. These consisted of 57 infantry, 5 cavalry, 1 armoured and 45 reservist or territorial divisions, supported by strong army troops of tanks and artillery. It should be noted, however, that part of these forces remained in North Africa and on the Alpine frontier in the initial stages. Author. The last category had the advantage of being made up of fully trained reservists, whereas the new German formations consisted to a great extent of raw recruits or reservists from the First World War. There can be no doubt, then, that the French army far outnumbered Germany's forces in the West from the very first day. The British contribution of land forces, on the other hand, was quite insignificant. It amounted to a mere 4 divisions, and even these did not arrive until the first half of October. The basis of the German plan of operations against Poland was to make maximum use of the way the frontier ran in order to envelop the enemy from the start. Thus, the German armies deployed in 2 widely divided flank groups, which left the central sector, the Oder-Warta Basin, almost wide open. Northern Army Group, Commander Colonel General Vers Bock, Chief of Staff General versus Salmuth. Northern Army Group comprised 2 armies embracing a total of 5 infantry and 1 armoured corps. Under command of these were 9 regular infantry divisions, including the newly formed 50 Infantry Division, which consisted of fortress troops and was not up to strength, 8 infantry divisions established on mobilisation, 2 armoured divisions, plus the newly formed tank task force Kemp, 2 motorised infantry divisions and 1 cavalry brigade, in all 21 divisions. Supplementing these in East Prussia were the fortress troops of Königsberg and Lotze, in Pomerania, the Netzer Brigade. 3rd Army deployed in East Prussia and 4th Army in East Pomerania. The task of the army group was to thrust through the Polish corridor, to throw the mass of its forces on the east of the Vistula towards the southeast or south, and then, after forcing the Narew line, to take any Polish defence of the Vistula from the rear. Southern Army Group, Commander Colonel General Verser Rundstedt, Chief of Staff General versus Manstein. Southern Army Group consisted of 3 armies: 14th, Colonel General List, 10th, Colonel General Verser Reichenau, and 8th, Colonel General Blaskowitz. In all, the army group had 8 infantry and 4 armoured corps, totalling 15 regular infantry divisions, 3 mountain divisions, 8 newly drafted divisions, and the bulk of the mechanised formations, 4 armoured, 4 light and 2 motorised infantry divisions. This made a total of 36 divisions. The Army Group deployed 14th Army in the Upper Silesian Industrial Region, Eastern Moravia and Western Slovakia, 10th Army in Upper Silesia around and to the south of Kreuzberg, and 8th Army in Central Silesia eastward of Oels. Its task was to defeat the enemy in the large bend of the Vistula and in Galicia, dash for Warsaw with strong motorised forces, taking the Vistula crossings as fast as possible on a broad front. In conjunction with Northern Army Group, destroy the remainder of the Polish army. Peacetime Poland had 30 infantry divisions, 11 cavalry brigades, 1 mountain brigade, 2 motorised armoured brigades. Additionally, there were a few Frontier Corps regiments and a large number of Home Defence (ON) battalions and naval troops stationed in the Gdynia Hel area. In other words, her aggregate strength was considerable. However, her weapons mainly dated from World War I, and her air force of some 1,000 aircraft was not up to modern standards. Germany had expected Poland to double the number of her divisions in the event of war, though it seemed doubtful whether the requisite arms were available. According to Wies Tippelkirch in his History of the Second World War, Poland drafted only enough regiments for 10 reserve divisions prior to the outbreak of hostilities, and even then, she apparently had no time to embody all of them in their scheduled divisions. Nevertheless, German intelligence did identify a number of reserve divisions in the course of the campaign. The Polish High Command disposed its forces as follows: deployed along the East Prussian frontier in front of the Bobonaro-Vistula line, a combat group of 2 divisions and 2 cavalry brigades between Suwałki and Tomza, the Modlin army of 4 divisions and 2 cavalry brigades on both sides of Mlawa. In the corridor was the Pomorze army of 5 divisions and 1 cavalry brigade. Facing the German frontier from the Warta to the Slovakian frontier were 3 armies. The Poznan army, with a strength of 4 divisions and 2 cavalry brigades in the western part of Poznan province. The Lodz army, 4 divisions and 2 cavalry brigades, around Wielun. The Krakow army, 6 divisions, 1 cavalry and 1 motorised brigade, between Czestochowa and Nowy Targ. Behind the 2 last-named armies was the Prussia army, 6 divisions and 1 cavalry brigade, in the area Tomaszów-Kielce. Finally, the deep flank along the Carpathian frontier was to be covered by a Carpathian army composed mainly of reserve units and ON battalions in echeloned formation. A reserve group, General Piskor's army, consisting of 3 divisions and 1 motorized brigade, remained on the Vistula in the area Modlin-Warsaw-Lublin. In the course of the campaign, an independent Policy group was formed east of the Bug, presumably for protection against Russia. In the event, the Polish deployment was still in progress when the German invasion started, and for this reason it was probably never properly completed in the form described above. It is difficult to decide the strategic aim of the Polish deployment, unless it was based on a wish to cover everything and surrender nothing voluntarily. It was a policy that usually leads to the defeat of the weaker party. Hitler was to have a similar experience only a few years later, without ever learning his lesson from it. Now, the difficulty of Poland's strategic position was quite obvious, consisting as it did in the inferiority of the Polish forces and the fact that the line of the frontier enabled Germany to attack from 2, later even from 3, sides at once. So when the Polish High Command still could not resist trying to hold on to everything, this only went to show how difficult it is to reconcile psychological and political inhibitions with hard military fact. Apart from Marshal Pilsudski and 1 or 2 sober-minded politicians, probably no one in Poland ever quite realized in what a dangerous situation the country had landed itself by enforcing its unjustified territorial demands on the neighbouring states of Russia and Germany. Yet this same Poland numbered only 35 million inhabitants, of whom a mere 22 million were of Polish nationality, the rest belonging to the German, Ukrainian, White Russian and Jewish minorities, all of which had been oppressed to one degree or another. Besides, in their reliance on their French allies, people in Poland had undoubtedly spent far too long in the years of Germany's and the Soviet Union's military weakness, dreaming of a chance for aggression against the Reich. Some had dreamt of raids on isolated East Prussia, or, thanks to the propaganda of the Polish Insurgents League, on German Upper Silesia. Others had even considered a march on Berlin, either by the shortest route through Poznari and Frankfurt, or by first conquering Upper Silesia and then advancing on the capital west of the Oder. Admittedly, such dreams had been frustrated by Germany's fortification of East Prussia and the Oder water basin, and later by her rearmament. But it is unlikely that Poland's politicians and soldiers, banking on a simultaneous French offensive in the west, ever put such aggressive ideas right out of their minds. Defensive though the above dispositions may well have been in the first instance, it is reasonable to infer that they were meant to leave the door open for offensive action at a later date, as soon as the first French assistance had made itself felt. For the rest, the Polish General Staff did not possess its own tradition of generalship shaped by long experience. On the one hand, the Polish temperament was more disposed towards attack than defence. It is fair to assume that the mind of the Polish soldier was still coloured, at least subconsciously, by romantic notions from bygone days. I am reminded here of a portrait I once saw of Marshal Ride Smigli painted against a background of charging Polish cavalry squadrons. On the other hand, the newly founded Polish army was French-taught. In view of the fact that French military thought since 1918 had been based on experience of static warfare, it could hardly have imbued the Poles with a sense of operational speed and mobility. It is conceivable, then, that except for a desire not to abandon anything to the enemy, the Polish deployment plan had no clear-cut operational objective whatever, and amounted merely to a compromise between the aggressive ambitions of yesteryear and the necessity of preparing for defence against a superior opponent. At the same time, the Poles made the mistake of assuming that the Germans would carry out an offensive on the French pattern, and that this would soon degenerate into positional warfare. Of some interest in this connection is a confidential report which we received just before the outbreak of war on the subject of Poland's allegedly offensive intentions. It emanated from a source, hitherto regarded as completely reliable, in the immediate circle of either the Polish president or Marshal Rydz-Śmigły, and contended that the Polish deployment would be offensive in character and include the concentration of strong forces in the province of Poznan. Most remarkable of all was the allegation that this plan of campaign had actually been proposed, if not demanded, by the British. In the circumstances, we found the whole thing rather improbable. Yet it was to emerge later that the Poles actually did assemble relatively strong forces in Poznan province, notwithstanding the fact that from their own point of view, this was the least likely direction from which to expect a German attack. The Poznan army was to meet its fate in the battle on the River Bzura. What was more, this line was only about 375 miles long, in contrast to the 1,125-mile arc described by the Polish frontier from Suwałki to the Carpathian passes. Acceptance of this suggestion would, of course, have necessitated abandoning the whole of western Poland, which embraced the country's most precious industrial and agricultural areas, and it is hardly likely that any Polish government would have survived such a step. What also had to be borne in mind was the fact that a withdrawal as extensive as this at the very start of hostilities was hardly likely to increase French aggressiveness in the west, and it was an open question whether surrendering the whole of western Poland to the Germans would not encourage the Russians, for their part, to take immediate steps to secure their share of the spoils in the east. Consequently, Colonel Schneider tells us, another solution was put forward by General Kutrzeba, director of the Polish Military Academy, in a memorandum he submitted to Marshal Rydz-Śmigły at the beginning of 1938. He insisted that there could be no question of giving up Poland's vital strategic zone, which embraced both the industrial regions of Lodz and Upper Silesia and the valuable agricultural areas of Poznan, Kutno and Kielce. Accordingly, he proposed a deployment plan which, while dropping any attempt to hold the corridor or Poznan province, substantially resembled the one ultimately implemented in 1939. To buttress the Polish defences, a far-reaching system of fortifications was to be built south of the East Prussian frontier, in a wide arc from Grudziądz to Poznan, and along the Silesian frontier from Ostrowo, through Częstochowa to Cieszyn. At the same time, General Kutrzeba pointed out, attention should be paid to preparing sally ports for later attacks against both East and West Prussia and Silesia. That to build such far-flung fortifications in adequate strength would have exceeded Polish potentialities was only too clear. Nevertheless, General Kutrzeba had recognized Poland's military inferiority vis-à-vis the Reich. His appraisal of French support was equally clear-sighted, since he took it for granted that even if France rendered the maximum military assistance, Poland would be thrown on her own resources for the first 6 or 8 weeks. He, therefore, envisaged a strategic defence along the western periphery of the above-mentioned vital zone, in the interior of which reserves were to assemble for the decisive operations later on. As I have said, the deployment carried out by the Polish army in 1939 was very similar to that recommended by the general. The latter, however, had envisaged making the main effort in the area Toruń-Bydgoszcz-Gniezno, whereas in 1939 there tended to be 2 focal points, one in the area around East Prussia and the other opposite Silesia. The Polish deployment of 1939, aimed as it was at covering everything, including the forward province of Poznan, was bound to bring defeat, in view of the Germans' superiority and their ability to outflank. How, then, should Poland have operated to avoid such a defeat? The first question to settle was whether the vital strategic zone referred to by General Kutrzeba was to be lost by itself, or, as a result of a German envelopment from East Prussia, Silesia and Slovakia, together with the Polish army. It was the same sort of question as I kept asking Hitler in the years 1943-4, every time he called on me to hold the Donets Basin, the Dnieper and other areas of Russia. To my mind, the answer to Poland's problem was perfectly clear. As far as her High Command was concerned, everything must hinge on the Polish army's ability to hold out at all costs until an offensive by the Western powers compelled the Germans to withdraw the mass of their forces from the Polish theatre. Then, though the loss of the industrial areas would appear, on the face of it, To render Poland incapable of fighting a war of any length, the army's continued existence as a combat force would still have held out the prospect of winning them back. Whatever happened, the Polish army must not allow itself to be encircled to the west or on both sides of the Vistula. The whole crux of Poland's problem was to play for time. Obviously, no decisive defence could be contemplated anywhere forward of the Bober-Naro-Vistula line, although it might be possible on the southern flank to move this front up as far as the Dunajec with a view to holding on to the central Polish industrial area between the Vistula and the San. The most important thing of all would have been to eliminate any possibility of encirclement by the Germans from East Prussia and Western Slovakia. A means of doing so in the north was offered by the line of the Bober-Naro and the Vistula down as far as the fortress of Modlin or Wyszegrád. This, at any rate, formed a strong natural obstacle, and additional support was afforded by the former Russian fortifications, obsolete though they were. A further point was that if any German armour at all appeared from East Prussia, it was unlikely to be in great strength. The problem in the south was to obviate an outflanking manoeuvre deep in Poland's rear by defending the Carpathian passes. Both tasks could undoubtedly have been fulfilled with limited forces. To deploy the Polish forces forward of the Bober-Naro line was just as big a blunder as pushing strong forces out into the corridor and the bulge of Poznan province. Once the necessary guarantees had been created against such deep outflanking in the north and south, it would have been possible to fight a delaying action in the west of Poland, always bearing in mind that the main German thrust was to be expected from Silesia. One reason for this was that the rail and road network in that part of the world allowed a quicker concentration of powerful forces than could be effected in Pomerania, or for that matter, in East Prussia. The other was that a drive on Warsaw via Poznan, being purely frontal, would have been operationally the least effective, and was therefore improbable. The Polish assembly of forces should not have taken place in the vicinity of the frontier, as happened in 1939, but far enough back for the defenders to identify the main direction of the German thrusts. This would have meant managing with a bare minimum of forces in the corridor and the Poznan area in order to oppose the main thrust from Silesia in the greatest possible strength, and, above all, to keep an adequate strategic reserve in hand. Had Poland concentrated on improving the former German fortifications on the Vistula between Torun and Grudziądz, instead of so long indulging in dreams of aggression, she could at least have delayed the link-up. Of the German forces advancing from Pomerania and East Prussia, similarly by properly fortifying Poznan, she could have curtailed the Germans' freedom of movement in that province. One further point is that the idea of utilising the inner defence line to deal counterblows in the north or south of western Poland, according to the way the situation developed, would hardly have worked out in practice. There was insufficient space available for operations of this sort, and the Polish railway network would not have stood the strain. Besides, the possibility had to be borne in mind that big troop movements would very soon have been hampered by the Germans' air forces and tank formations. Consequently, there was nothing for it but to plan the really decisive defence as far back as the Bober-Naro-Vistula-San, or Dunajec line, and merely to fight for time anywhere forward of this, always remembering that one had to place the main effort opposite Silesia from the very start, and simultaneously ensure due protection on the northern and southern flanks. No one can argue that any of these measures would have saved Poland from ultimate defeat if, as proved to be the case, she were abandoned to her fate by the West. Nevertheless, they would have saved the Poles being so easily overrun in their frontier areas, as a result of which the Polish High Command was unable either to fight a set battle in the Vistula Bend or to withdraw its forces behind the great line of rivers and take up a prepared defence. From the very first day, Poland could only fight for time. All she could do was to hold out against German attacks, ultimately behind the river line, until an Allied offensive in the west compelled the Germans to pull back. It should therefore have been incumbent on the Polish military leaders to tell their government quite bluntly that they could not go to war against the Reich without a binding guarantee from the Western powers that the moment hostilities broke out, they would launch an offensive in the west with all the resources at their disposal. No government could have disregarded such a warning in view of the decisive influence wielded at the time by the Polish Commander-in-Chief, Marshal Rydz-Śmigły. The government ought to have come to terms on the Danzig and corridor question while there was still time, if only to postpone a war with Germany. In 1940, our troops in France captured a letter, dated 10th September 1939, from General Gamelin to the Polish military attaché in Paris. It was obviously a reply to an inquiry from the Poles as to when they could expect any effective military assistance. The comments made by Gamelin for onward transmission to Marshal Rydz-Śmigły were as follows. More than half our regular divisions in the northeast are in action. Since we crossed the frontier, the Germans have been resisting energetically, despite which we have made some headway. However, we are tied down in a static war with an enemy well prepared for defence, and I have not yet all the necessary artillery. There has been aerial warfare from the outset in conjunction with the operations on the ground, and we are conscious of having a considerable part of the Luftwaffe opposite us. I have thus fulfilled in advance my promise to start the offensive with my main forces a fortnight after the first day of the French mobilization. It was impossible for me to do more. It follows from this that Poland did in fact have a guarantee from the French in her possession. The only question is whether the Polish High Command should have been satisfied with one which did not commit the French to start the offensive till a whole fortnight had elapsed. In any case, events have since shown that the above promise was meant to imply anything but swift and effective aid to Poland. Poland's defeat was the inevitable outcome of the Warsaw government's illusions about the action its allies would take, as well as of its overestimation of the Polish army's ability to offer lengthy resistance. When our troops crossed the Polish frontier at daybreak on 1st September 1939, we of the Army Group staff were naturally at our posts in the Monastery of the Holy Cross at Nice. This was a training establishment for Catholic missionaries situated outside the town and offered an ideal wartime setting for a senior headquarters staff by virtue of its size and seclusion and the unembellished state of its classrooms and cells. To a certain extent, the Spartan existence of its normal inmates, from whom we had taken over part of the building, reflected itself in our own standard of living. For though our camp commandant came from the famous Lowenbräu in Munich, he showed little inclination to pamper us. As a matter of course, we drew ordinary rations like any other troops, and the midday stews we got from the field kitchen certainly gave us no cause for complaint. On the other hand, I really cannot believe that the evening menu need have been limited day after day to army bread and hard-preserved sausage, which our older gentlemen had considerable difficulty in masticating. Fortunately, the monks helped out with occasional lettuces or vegetables from their kitchen garden. On a number of evenings, the Army Group Commander and his senior staff were joined by the abbot, who retailed fascinating accounts of the self-sacrificing work of the missionaries in distant parts of the globe. This was a welcome distraction, however brief, from the burning problems which the immediate future presented. September the 1st put an end to these talks, however. Henceforth, the battle claimed every moment of our time. The fact that we were in our offices so early that morning was due less to any practical necessity than to the feeling that we had to be in readiness from the very moment our troops made contact with the enemy. For it was certain that many hours would pass before we heard any vital news from the armies under our command. These were the hours familiar to anyone who has worked on a higher formation staff, the phase in which events have already begun to take their course, and one can only await developments. The soldier at the front knows the tremendous tension that mounts before an attack, as the platoon commander's watch ticks steadily onto the moment of release when the assault can go in. From then on, however, the front-line fighter is completely taken up with the battle around him, and quite oblivious of anything else. The difference with a formation staff, and the higher one goes, the more this applies, is that the moment of attack marks the beginning of a period of waiting that is charged with suspense and anxiety. Subordinate formations quite rightly dislike getting inquiries about the progress of a battle, which they are liable to interpret as a sign of nervousness. Consequently, it is better just to sit and wait. A point worth noting in this respect is that the saying about bad news travelling fast seldom applies in the military sphere. Whenever things are going well, news usually finds its way back quickly enough. If, on the other hand, the attack gets stuck, a blanket of silence descends on the front, either because communications have been cut or because those concerned prefer to hang on till they have something more encouraging to report. And so the tension breaks only when the first reports come in, whether these be good or bad. Pending their arrival, we too could only sit and wait. Would the troops on whom we had expended so much labour and effort, but whose training had been carried out far too quickly, come up to expectation? In particular, would the big armoured formations, the organisation and use of which constituted something completely new, justify the hopes of their creator, General Guderian, and ourselves? Would the German headquarters staffs, in particular our own army group, be able to master the opening situation and go on to win a complete victory that would destroy the enemy while he was still west of the Vistula and remove any danger of a war on two fronts? Such were the questions running through our minds in those hours of tension and uncertainty. It was envisaged in OKH's plan for a large-scale outflanking operation against the Polish army from East Prussia and Silesia that Northern Army Group, having once established a link between East Prussia and Pomerania by expelling the Polish forces from the corridor, would be able to get straight behind the Vistula in order to attack the main enemy forces in the large bend of the river from the rear. The task that must devolve on Southern Army Group, on the other hand, was to try to engage the enemy as far forward as the Vistula and to frustrate any attempt he might make to withdraw behind the line of the Vistula and San. This meant that 10th Army's tank formations, with its infantry divisions following as closely as possible behind, must make a concerted effort to overrun the enemy troop assemblies that would probably be taking place near the frontier, and that the tanks should, if possible, reach the Vistula crossings from Demblin to Warsaw ahead of the enemy. It also presupposed that 14th Army, which was to advance through Galicia, would reach and cross the San with the greatest possible speed. In the event of the enemy's intending to place his decisive resistance as far back as the San and Vistula, this army could immediately unhinge the river defences from the south and join up, deep in the enemy's rear, with the eastern wing of Northern Army Group as it approached from the north. 14th Army was bound to be assisted here by the fact that its right wing, by extending so far eastward into Slovakia, constituted an immediate threat to the deep flank of the enemy forces concentrating in the Krakow area, and thereby made it impossible to effect any protracted defence of Galicia. Such was the course of action on which Southern Army Group based its operations in Poland. It strove throughout to engage and destroy the main body of the enemy forward of the Vistula, but at the same time remained ready to anticipate any attempt he might make to avoid accepting the decisive battle until he was behind the San Vistula line. Instead of giving a day-to-day account of the operations, useful though a detailed survey of this lightning campaign would undoubtedly be, I would rather confine myself to a broad outline of its essential phases. These, partly in chronological sequence and partly simultaneous, were as follows. The heavy frontier battles fought by 14th Army in Galicia, and the latter's subsequent pursuit of the beaten enemy to Lwów, and over the Sand 10th Army's breakthrough to the Vistula, and the Battle of the Radom Pocket. The Battle of the Bzura, which was conducted direct from HQ Southern Army Group, and led to the destruction of the strongest enemy grouping by 8th and 10th Armies. The attack on Warsaw and the final battles which resulted from the frequent changes in the agreements entered into by Germany's political leaders with the Soviets, who were by now marching into eastern Poland. The latter crossed the Polish frontier on 17th September 1939. The first object of 14th Army was to encircle the strong enemy forces believed to be in the area of Krakow. This encirclement was already inherent in the army's extensive deployment from Silesia through the region of Morawska Ostrava, Mährisch Ostrau, to the Carpathians. While 8 Corps, General Busch, 8 and 28 infantry and 5 panzer divisions, was to break through the strong Polish frontier fortifications in eastern Upper Silesia and then advance on Krakow along the north of the Vistula. 17 Corps, General Kienitz, 7 and 44 infantry divisions, moved on Krakow to the south of the Vistula from Moravia. The task of directly outflanking the enemy forces thought to be around Krakow fell to 2 further army corps. 22 Panzer Corps, General Versekleist, 2 Panzer and 4 light divisions, which was to drive on Krakow from the south out of the Orava Valley in the Western Carpathians, and 18 Mountain Corps, General Bayer, 2 and 3 mountain divisions, which was to break out of the Poprad Valley east of the High Tatra, with the aim of advancing through Nowy Swansezy, Neusandes, on Bochnia, west of Tarnów, and taking the enemy at Krakow in the rear. Still further east, the Slovakian forces, later released by OKH, had to attack through the Dukla Pass, so well known from World War I days, Fern Mountain Division, a seasoned Bavarian formation, and 2 reserve divisions were allocated to this enveloping wing later on. Though 14th Army's initial battles, in particular those fought by 8 Silesian Corps for the Polish frontier fortifications, proved hard going, the issue in these frontier regions was virtually decided already from the operational point of view by the outflanking movement from the Carpathians. Admittedly, the proposed encirclement of the enemy grouping around Krakow did not come off in the literal sense, as the enemy recognized the danger threatening him and duly evacuated western Galicia. But the bulk of his forces were still smashed in these first battles, and the chase that followed, in the course of which 22 Panzer Corps succeeded in overhauling its quarry. They took the army's right wing, the Mountain Corps, and 17 Corps, as far as Lwów and the fortress of Przemysl, both of which were captured. The left wing, consisting of the Panzer Corps, 8 Corps and 7 Corps allocated to the army by the Army Group, was able to cross the San above its junction with the Vistula, and though our opponents fought back bravely in the subsequent battles, which were in part extremely heavy, further enemy forces, some of them coming from Warsaw or Northern Army Group's front, were wiped out. In due course, we joined hands with the left wing of Northern Army Group. By 15th September, Lwów and Przemysl having fallen, the pursuit was virtually over, even if the destruction of the remaining Polish units in this area and east of the San was to call for further fighting. While the object of 14th Army's operations, apart from annihilating the forces deployed in western Galicia, was to pursue and catch a retreating enemy, the crucial role of thrusting through to the Vistula devolved on the stronger 10th Army, with its powerful complement of armour, while the weaker 8th Army was to cover the northern flank of the operation against the enemy forces believed to be in the Kalisz Lodz area and Poznań province. 10th Army attacked from Upper Silesia, the left wing from around Kreuzberg, with 4 corps up. Reading from right to left, these were 15 motorized corps, General Hoth, 2 and 3 light divisions, 4 corps, General Verschwedler, 4 and 46 infantry divisions, 16 Panzer Corps, General Hübner 1 and 4 panzer divisions, 14 and 31 infantry divisions, and 11 corps, General Lieb, 18 and 19 divisions. 14 motorized corps, General Ver Wietersheim, 13 and 29 motorized and 1 light divisions, followed up. Following behind the army as an army group reserve were 7 corps, General Ver Schobert, 27 and 68 infantry divisions, and 62 infantry division. 8th Army, composed of 13 corps, General Vers Weixs, 10 and 17 infantry divisions and the motorized Leibstandarte, and 10 corps, General Ulex, 24 and 30 divisions, had to advance in deeply echeloned formation in the direction of Lodz. This army, too, was followed by 2 divisions, 213 and 221, of the Army Group Reserve. Immediately after the German armies had crossed the frontier at dawn on 1st September 1939, violent fighting started, in the course of which the enemy was thrown back. For the next few days, our big problem was whether he would still seek to join the decisive battle forward of the Vistula, or whether his object in the present fighting was to gain time in which to get his forces back behind the river. Initially, at all events, there were signs of strong enemy groupings forming in the mountainous country of Isa Gora around Kielce at Radom and around ODEs. What decided the battles of these first few weeks, however, were probably two factors which had appeared for the very first time in this campaign. One was the tearing open of the enemy's front by tank formations, which penetrated deep into his rear areas, and with which, incidentally, our infantry divisions were hard-pressed to keep up. The other was the almost complete elimination of the enemy's air force, and the crippling of his staff communications and transport network by the effective attacks of our Luftwaffe. For these reasons, no centralized control of operations was ever really achieved by the Poles. By reason of the situation on the enemy side, Army Group HQ found it necessary to set 10th Army two objectives. One group on the right, 14 motorized corps and 4 corps, followed through by 7 corps, which was not moved over to 14th Army until later on, had to attack and defeat the enemy grouping still assembling around Radom. Another group on the left, consisting of 16 Panzer Corps, 14 motorized corps and 11 corps, was to cut off the enemy's line of retreat from the Odz area to Warsaw, while 8th Army attacked from the west. In pursuit of these orders, 10th Army succeeded in engaging the Radom grouping in the wooded mountains of Isagora, while the mobile 15 motorized corps moved in between it and the Vistula crossings of Opatov and Demblin, and the 14 motorized corps, operating from the army's left-hand group in the north, also barred the way to Warsaw. By 9th September, the first pocket of the war had closed round an enemy army. Though the fighting in the Kielce-Radom region went on till 12th September, as a result of the enemy's efforts to burst out of the ring enclosing him, his fate was already sealed. By the end of the battle, 60,000 prisoners and 130 guns were in our hands, and the enemy had forfeited 7 divisions. Even if he had succeeded in getting back across the Vistula, this would not have helped him, for on the day the Battle of Radom ended, 14th Army already had its one mountain division at the gates of Wau, and the army's left wing, through having crossed the lower San, was in a position to unhinge any enemy defence of the Vistula. Meanwhile, 16 Panzer Corps, which belonged to the left-hand group of 10th Army, had fought its way to the Vistula crossing of Góra Kalwaria, south of Warsaw, and one armoured division had penetrated into the southwest suburbs. These forces were actually too weak to capture a city fortified as Warsaw was, and the armoured division had to be pulled out again. The fact remained, however, that the enemy's western approach to the capital was now blocked. While fighting was still going on in the Radom area, even if signs of victory there were already apparent, our attention was drawn to the northern wing of the army group as a result of an enemy initiative. During the first 9 days of the campaign, everything had run so smoothly and so completely according to plan that one was tempted to believe that little could happen now to interrupt or cause any real change in the scheduled course of operations. Nonetheless, I still had a vague feeling that something was brewing on the northern flank of the army group. We knew, after all, that the enemy had assembled strong forces in Poznań province which had not yet come to light. For this reason, on 8th and 9th of September, I had repeatedly pointed out to the Chief of Staff of 8th Army that he must pay special heed to reconnaissance on his northern flank. Discussions between ourselves and OKH regarding the location of these Poznań forces had produced a teleprinter message from OKH on 9th September to the effect that the enemy was moving them off to the east with all the transport he could muster, and that a threat to 8th Army's deep flank need no longer be feared. Nevertheless, we reckoned that there must be some 10 enemy divisions south of the Vistula between Łódź and Warsaw. It will be recalled that the army group had intended to use 10th Army to block the route back to Warsaw of an enemy grouping of 5 or 6 divisions, thought to be around Łódź, while 8th Army had also been directed to attack this force from the west. 8th Army's original task, the provision of deeply echeloned protection to the entire army group operation on its northern flank, naturally still held good. It would appear, nevertheless, that HQ 8th Army paid rather more attention to the aforementioned task than to developments in the north, for early on 10th September it reported a surprise attack from that quarter against its 30 Division, launched by considerably stronger enemy forces. The situation threatened to become critical, as attempts by the army to restore it by counterattacks failed one after the other. However, the army still reckoned on halting the enemy, who was undoubtedly present in strength and presumably composed in the main of forces drawn back from Poznan province, and for this purpose wheeled both its corps round to form a defensive front facing north. All the same, it asked to be quickly reinforced by one panzer corps in order to prevent any southward enemy breakthrough to Łódź, which had been occupied without resistance on 9th September. Army Group HQ, however, was by no means disposed to see the situation of 8th Army restored by a reinforcement of its front. Even if a local crisis, and possibly a serious one at that, were to arise here, it would have not the least bearing on the operations as a whole. On the contrary, it actually offered us the chance of winning a big victory, since strong enemy forces had now been committed to a battle west of the Vistula. And this, if the right actions were taken on our own side, would end in their destruction. Instead of acceding to 8th Army's request for the additional support of a panzer corps, therefore, Army Group HQ started making preparations for the enemy's encirclement. The two divisions following 8th Army as an Army Group reserve were anyway still approaching from the west, and these could be presented against the western flank of the enemy now attacking 8th Army from the north. For the same purpose, a light division was ordered over from the battle now drawing to a close around Radom. What the Army Group desired above all was to compel the enemy to fight a battle with reversed front. To this end, it directed 10th Army to turn round 16 Panzer Corps, now at the southern perimeter of Warsaw, and 11 Corps, which was following the latter, in order to intervene in 8th Army's battle from the east. The latter's own task was to hold off the enemy as long as he kept up his assault, but once this perceptibly slackened off, to go over to the attack. As a result of impressions gathered by Colonel General Verser Rundstedt and myself on visits to HQ 8th Army at this time, during one of which Hitler was also present, Army Group decided to assume direct control of the operation. The attack by the two corps of 10th Army intervening from the south and southeast was to be directed by Colonel General Verser Reichenau himself, while HQ 8th Army was left in charge of the fighting of its two corps facing north and the envelopment of the enemy from the west. Finally, at the request of our Army Group, 3 Corps, which had crossed the Vistula from the north in the enemy's rear as part of Northern Army Group, was brought in to close the ring. When it became apparent in the course of the battle that large elements of the enemy were striving to escape along the Vistula to the fortress of Modlin, Army Group even pulled up 15 motorized corps from the Radom region to block this last escape route. After heavy fighting in which the enemy had tried to break out first to the south, then to the southeast, and ultimately to the east, his resistance finally collapsed on 18th of September. By 20th of September, 10th Army had reported the capture of 80,000 prisoners and booty amounting to 320 guns, 130 aircraft, and 40 tanks. 8th Army reported 90,000 prisoners and as yet uncalculated amounts of captured equipment. 9 enemy infantry divisions, 3 cavalry brigades, and elements of 10 further divisions had been involved in this defeat. In point of fact, many more formations than we had supposed. The Battle of the Bzura was the biggest self-contained action of the Polish campaign and constituted its climax, even if not its decisive engagement. The latter, operationally speaking, lay in the far-flung envelopment of the entire Polish forces by Northern Army Group in the north and 14th Army in the south. Whether this one large-scale counter-move arose from a hope on the part of the Polish command that it could still change its fortune in the Vistula Bend, or whether it was merely directed towards clearing the way to Warsaw for the enemy forces south of the Vistula, it could have no further influence on the fate of the Polish army. Even if the Battle of the Bzura did not measure up in actual results to the big battles of encirclement fought in Russia later on, it was still the largest of its kind to date. It was not one which could be planned from the outset through penetration of the enemy front by powerful tank formations, but arose from counter-moves made on the German side when the enemy's own actions unexpectedly gave us our big opportunity. After the Battle of the Bzura and a series of actions in the wooded country south of Modlin against enemy elements trying to escape from the fortress towards Warsaw, our army group was given the task of taking the capital. Even now, certain of its formations were being moved off to the west, where the French and British, much to our surprise, had looked idly on as their Polish ally was being annihilated. We had already reported to OKH that the preparations for the assault on Warsaw could not be complete before 25th of September, our main motive being a wish to avail ourselves of the whole of the army artillery, including that of the 14th Army. However, after the Soviet intervention on 17th of September and the establishment of the Vistula as a demarcation line, Hitler was in a great hurry to take the city and ordered that it must be in our hands by the last day of the month. While it is not abnormal, I suppose, for politicians to expect the generals to win a victory, it was undoubtedly a new departure for them to go as far as fixing the actual date. Apart from this, Army Group was disposed to conduct the attack in a manner which would keep casualties down to a bare minimum. The only reason why the city had to be attacked at all was that the enemy had taken steps to defend it with an entire army, and that the Polish commander-in-chief had announced that it would be held to the last. The army group was well aware that in the circumstances nothing could be expected of a surprise attack on the city. On no account, however, did it wish to become involved in a battle inside Warsaw, whatever reasons might be given for doing so. This would inevitably have caused extraordinarily high losses, both to the attacking troops and the civil population. 8th Army, which had been charged with the capture of the city, was accordingly ordered to confine its attack to investing the fortress area with a tight, unbroken ring of troops, roughly coinciding with the line of the circular railway. The city would then be compelled to surrender by a combination of artillery bombardments and air raids, or, if these did not produce results, by a food and water shortage. I might mention here that Army Group HQ had successfully opposed an earlier wish of Hitler's to have the city bombed by the Luftwaffe, our argument then being that no air raid at that particular juncture would have had a direct bearing on or in any way benefited military operations. In the present instance, however, these same reasons served to justify bombardment. On 25th of September, fire was opened on the outer forts and strongpoints, as well as on important supply centres. At the same time, the localised attacks to reach the predetermined siege line began. On 26th of September, we dropped leaflets warning that the city was about to be shelled and calling on its occupants to surrender. As the Polish troops continued to offer stubborn resistance, the actual bombardment was begun on the evening of the same day. At noon on 27th September, Colonel General Verser Rundstedt and I learnt during a visit to my old 18 Division, which had just taken 2 forts, that the enemy had offered to capitulate. The shelling was immediately stopped. The capitulation was signed next day by the Polish Army commander and Colonel General Blaskowitz, commander of the German 8th Army. It provided for immediate succour to the civil population and enemy wounded and in every way upheld the military honour of an enemy defeated after a gallant struggle. It was agreed that the officers should retain their swords and that the non-commissioned officers and men should go into captivity for only as long as it took to dispose of the necessary formalities. According to the Polish plenipotentiary, 120,000 officers and men capitulated in Warsaw. When signing the instrument of capitulation, the Polish general said, "A wheel always turns." He was to prove right in the end, though hardly, as far as the subsequent fate of his fatherland was concerned, in the sense his words had been meant to convey. Although the bulk of the enemy forces committed forward of the Vistula had been eliminated in the Battle of the Bzura and the fall of Warsaw, numerous other engagements, some of them quite heavy, were still being fought in the 14th Army's area in eastern Galicia, and on the far side of the Lower San against individual groups of the enemy who had so far escaped destruction. In the meantime, 10th Army had also got a corps across the Vistula at Dęblin to advance on Lublin. In the midst of this fighting, we suddenly received orders from the Supreme Command to hand over Lwów, which had just capitulated to the troops of the 14th Army. to the Soviets and to retire along the whole army group front behind the demarcation line arranged by Ribbentrop in Moscow. This ran from the Uzok Pass to Przemiel and then along the San and Vistula to the north of Warsaw. Thus, the battles fought on the far side of those two rivers had been wasted effort as far as the units of Southern Army Group were concerned and had only benefited the Soviets. To get back across the San, we had to disengage from an enemy grouping whose strength we still estimated at 2 or 3 divisions and 1 or 2 cavalry brigades. These forces now showed tremendous courage, though at the same time a complete misunderstanding of the overall situation, in going over to the attack themselves in an attempt to prevent our 7 and 8 Corps from reaching the river. Here again, heavy fighting ensued purely in consequence of the political haggling still going on between the German and Soviet governments. The extent of this was best shown by the fact that on 1st October a further alteration was made to the demarcation line. This time our orders were to reoccupy Lublin province. 14 motorized corps therefore crossed the Vistula again and received the capitulation of the last enemy grouping still in action as it withdrew towards the river before the advancing Soviets. The Polish campaign was over. In the course of it, Southern Army Group had taken 523,236 prisoners and captured 1,401 field pieces, 7,600 machine guns, 274 aircraft, 96 fighting vehicles, and an incalculable quantity of other equipment. The enemy's losses in blood were undoubtedly very high indeed, for he had fought with great gallantry and had shown a grim determination to hold out in even the most hopeless situations. Our own army group's losses were as follows: officers 505, dead 759, wounded 42, missing NCOs and other ranks, Xtalzao 49, dead 19th 709, wounded 4,022 missing. On 5th of October, Hitler held a victory parade in Warsaw of all the divisions stationed in and around the city, taking the salute at a march past on the big avenue leading from the Belvedere to the castle. Unfortunately, the occasion ended on a discordant note which only too clearly revealed his attitude towards the leaders of the army. It had been arranged that before flying back to Germany, Hitler should meet the commanders and commanding officers of the troops that had taken part in the parade, and for this purpose a table had been laid in a hangar where they were to be served with plates of soup from a field kitchen. When he came into the hangar and caught sight of the white cloths and autumn flowers on the table, however, Hitler turned on his heel and joined the troops at a field kitchen outside. Having swallowed a few spoonfuls of soup and chatted to the men around him, he made straight for his waiting aircraft. It was a patent attempt to demonstrate his attachment to the popular masses. Yet I very much doubt whether he really won the approval of those gallant grenadiers of ours by such behaviour. They would, I am sure, have fully appreciated the gesture if, after the victories they had won, the head of state had honoured the troops as a whole by a visit to their commanders. His treatment of the latter was a snub which, happening when it did, inevitably set one thinking. Before long, the Polish campaign was being described as the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. Indeed, as far as its speed of execution and the outcome were concerned, it did constitute something almost unique until the German offensive in the West produced a similar development on an even bigger scale. In order to assess it fairly, however, one must bear in mind what was said in a previous chapter about Poland's prospects in this war. In point of fact, the Germans were bound to win this campaign by virtue of their superiority and their infinitely more favourable starting conditions, provided that 2 stipulations were fulfilled. One was that the German command accepted a very high degree of risk in the West in order to have the necessary superiority in the East. The other was that the Western powers did not in any way exploit this risk to render timely aid to the Poles. There cannot be any doubt that things might have turned out very differently had the Western powers taken the offensive in the West at the earliest possible moment. This would, of course, have presupposed the existence of a Polish command with a rather greater sense of reality. A command which, instead of scattering all its resources from the outset in an effort to cling on to what could not be held, would have concentrated its forces at the crucial points and fought systematically for the time needed to confront the Germans with the dilemma of a real war on two fronts. The bravery with which the Polish troops fought right up to the end would have been an adequate guarantee of their ability to hold on until the Allies reached the Rhine and forced the German command seriously to consider calling off the campaign in Poland. And so, in this case too, as Count Schlieffen had once put it, the weaker party made their own contribution to the victory of their adversaries. On the other hand, it must also be recognized that the speed and completeness of our success in Poland were ultimately due, apart from our operational advantage at the start and the numerical superiority we had achieved by accepting a big risk in the West, to the better leadership and higher quality of the German fighting troops. A vital factor in the speed of our success was the unorthodox use of big, self-sufficient tank formations supported by a far superior air force. But what had been really decisive, next to the steadfast courage and devotion of the German soldier, was the spirit pervading the German staffs and fighting troops. While the material achievement of rearmament had certainly been largely due to Hitler's own efforts, material superiority alone would by no means have guaranteed so swift and conclusive a victory. The most important thing of all was that our little Reichswehr, once rather looked down upon by many people, had revived Germany's great tradition of training and leadership after carrying it through the aftermath of the 1918 defeat. The new German Wehrmacht, as the child of that Reichswehr, had found, and was probably alone in doing so, how to prevent warfare from degenerating into a static war or, as General Fuller expressed it in connection with the final stage of World War I, into ironmongery. In the German Wehrmacht, it had been found possible, with the help of the new means of warfare, to reacquire the true art of leadership in mobile operations. Individual leadership was fostered on a scale unrivaled in any other army, right down to the most junior NCO or infantryman, and in this lay the secret of our success. The new Wehrmacht had passed its first test with flying colours. So far, even the army staff had been able to act without interference from outside. So far, the military commanders had retained full authority of command. So far, the troops had had a purely military battle to fight, and for that reason it had still been possible to fight chivalrously. On 15th of October, Colonel Husinger of the OKH Operations Branch came to see us with the welcome news that our headquarters was also to be moved to the Western Front at the end of the month. Our place was to be taken by HQ, 8th Army under Colonel General Blaskowitz. Shortly afterwards, I myself was instructed to present myself at OKH in Zossen on 21st October for the purpose of receiving our operation orders for the West. I left Lodz on the 18th to pay a brief visit to my family and brother-in-law, who was lying severely wounded in a Breslau hospital. Then there was a new task to be faced. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer. Richard III. Happy to have escaped the thankless task of having to act as the occupying power in Poland, our headquarters arrived on the Western Front on 24th of October 1939, to take command of the newly formed Army Group A. The armies under command, 12th and 16th, had their forward divisions in position along the frontiers of southern Belgium and Luxembourg, and their rear units strung out as far back as the right bank of the Rhine. It had been decided that Army Group HQ would be located in Koblenz. We duly moved into the Hotel Riesen-Fürstenhof beside the Rhine, a place which in my early days at the cadet school in the nearby market town of Engers I had regarded as the very peak of elegance and culinary refinement. But now wartime restrictions had left their mark even on this famous establishment. Our offices were situated in a once charming old building near the Deutsches Eck, which until the outbreak of war had accommodated the Koblenz division. The lovely rococo rooms of yesteryear were now bare and gloomy. Not far from this building, in a small square lined with ancient trees, stood an obelisk of considerable interest. It bore a bombastic inscription, having been erected by the French commandant of Koblenz in 1812 to mark the crossing of the Rhine by Napoleon's Grand Army on its march to Russia. Below the original inscription another had been engraved. Its approximate purport was, "Noted and approved," and it bore the signature of the Russian general who had become commandant of Koblenz in 1814. What a pity Hitler never saw this. At my suggestion, our command staff had received the valuable addition of a second, older general staff officer for the operations branch. He was the then Lieutenant Colonel versus Treschow, who put an end to his life in July 1944 as one of the main forces behind the conspiracy against Hitler. Treschow had already worked under me in peacetime in the 1st Department of the General Staff of the Army, Order of Battle and Operations, TAR. He was a most talented officer and an ardent patriot. With his quick brain, his many accomplishments, and his cosmopolitan and gentlemanly ways, he had a special charm of his own, and his elegant aristocratic appearance was fully complemented by his beautiful and equally intelligent wife, a daughter of the former War Minister and Chief of the General Staff, Versa Falkenhayn. In those days, there could hardly have been a more charming couple in Berlin army circles than the Treschows.